Welcome back to Fast Mark on the Schwab Network. I'm Diane King Hall alongside Tom White in our Chicago studio. Time now for our cash tag segment. For that, we want to bring in our next guest. We've got Andy Swan, co-founder of LikeFolio, joining us today, taking a look at GM ahead of its earnings. So, Andy, you all have new sentiment data on GM. I'm curious to know what it looks like right now, especially given, I know you also compare stock performance, and the stock has had some challenges this year, partly because of tariffs. What's your take overall on your data?
Yeah, GM, we understand why the stock has had problems. I don't think there's any compelling reason to own the stock other than potentially, valuation. But from a consumer interest standpoint, consumers are pretty ho-hum about the entire GM lineup. If we look at consumer interest scores over time, really very flat, very neutral, just not a lot going on. I think the one bright spot that we had for Q3 was the electric vehicle sales that the company was able to churn out. But no one really believes that pace is sustainable. There was a lot of tax credit incentives that went into that. The tax credit winding down at the end of the quarter really pulled forward some demand. And we think, the company's taken a $1.6 billion restructuring charge on its EV lineups. And so with GM, we're kind of in wait and see mode. I think this one's going to be all about forward guidance. It's going to be all about tariff impacts, et cetera. We've got to get to the point, I think, with GM that they start to come up. We really need something exciting out of the company, and we haven't had it for a very long time. This seems like a company that's really just kind of managing itself, managing its outlooks, managing its investor expectations, financially engineering its way to beating estimates that have been sandbagged a little bit. That's what feels like is going on at GM, and we're just ready for a little bit of a renaissance in terms of the product lineup. Give us something new and exciting to talk about, because it's been a very long time since we've had that from General Motors.
Yeah, Andy, you mentioned that EV sales up 107% year over year. Yeah, it was a pull forward from the EV tax credits going away. You mentioned that $1.6 billion charge they're taking. It's funny how they came out with that right after the EV tax credit. And they said they were going to extend them, but they're not. But I think my question would be, if they're still so reliant on the OEMs, the internal combustion engine moving forward, is this all about the consumer and the health of the consumer, whether the market's at all-time highs, you have a job at 4.3%? Is that what your data reflects with a name like GM that's not really like a volatile, high-profile name that moves quite a bit, and they're continually upgrading their models and such?
Yeah, I think it's a great, proxy for the economy overall. And, we've talked with you guys a lot about the K-shaped economy, the luxury versus the have-nots. GM's right in the middle of all of that. I think that their kind of higher-end brands are probably doing better than their lower-end brands. The lower-end brand consumer is really getting pinched here. I think it is a good proxy for the entire economy. And one reason we should all be listening to and paying attention to the GM earnings call is not so much about GM, but about the economy as a whole, the consumer as a whole. Because I think, when you're selling $40-something billion worth of cars to people across the economic spectrum, you've got pretty good insight into the health of the consumer and to consumer debt levels. So that'll be telling, and I think help us form our thesis going forward this earnings season to make sure that we're on the right track with some of the things that we believe going into this. So I think you're right. GM is more about the economy than it is about GM.
So GM had a better year last year, Andy, and look, the Silverado was the top of their list in terms of vehicles. I don't know if you have indications if that's still, top there, but in your past analysis where, I know you've looked at this before, what does it look like? Does the shift in consumer signals, what does that typically suggest about where the consumer is going? Does it suggest that they are going away from GM? Has that been the pattern in the past?
Yeah, and I would say it's just it's not a mass exodus, it's just slow exodus. And again, GM doesn't have the most compelling product lineup that gets people excited to go back to the dealership. And so when people, it comes time to get a new car, they're going to go check out, the Chevrolets, the Silverados, et cetera. But they're also going to check out the competitors, which have made, enormous strides since the last time they bought a GM car. So I think that there's just this kind of slow churn away from GM that needs to be stopped and rectified. And GM's got to do something fairly bold to get there. And so I hope that they're coming out, with a strategic plan, and we hear something about 2026, 2027, because this is a big barge to turn around. But I think it can be done, and there's been a lot of examples of companies that have done so. And so, when we look at GM, we just think kind of boring, middle of the road, proxy for the economy. That hasn't changed, and I hope it does soon. But until then, we're going to use the GM conference call, as a looking glass into the economy as a whole, rather than the automotive industry or even GM itself.
Yeah, I think the Cadillac brand's been doing really well, but that's a high-end consumer that's still holding up at this point. They've got their new F1 team starting. Maybe that's going to be a catalyst for them. But Andy, what kind of earnings score do you guys have on this one going into this report?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're just dead neutral on this one. I think that the stock price has fallen off to where it should be. We think it's fairly priced. I think they probably beat expectations and then have guidance that gives investors a little pause. And so I think we're probably right where we should be on GM, and not a whole lot to do in terms of movement going forward.
Okay, will be interesting to see how they perform tomorrow. We got a lot of earnings to dig into tomorrow. Thank you, Andy. That is Andy Swan, co-founder of LikeFolio. And Tom, they've got earnings